And so now, for those offers, those developers need to go back and look at their profile, so their S-curve, which National Grid will have issued, which gives them this idea of profile of risk. And they basically need the key things that they need to look at when their milestones are going to hit, whether or not they think they can meet them, and if they were to not meet a milestone, what would be the cancellation charge at that date? So I would be going through my S-curve with a highlighter to highlight what my liabilities would be at those milestone dates, and I suspect that will make people understand the risk of, can they stick with their existing connection agreement, or do they need to mod up because it's just too risky?
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Roadnight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Right, hi everybody. We are talking about today the snappily titled CMP 376, which I understand is to do with transmission milestones. But just very quickly to introduce who we've got in the room, we've got Pete Aston, Catherine Cleary, and I've been waiting for a very, very long time to say this, that we've got our fifth connectologist joining us for the first time. We started on Monday, and so this is his first podcast. So welcome to Kyle Murchie.
Woo. Thanks all.
Cool, excellent. Few words. Hopefully he'll have more to add. Good. So I have a list of questions here, and the first one was very obvious. So CMP 376, and I can't remember who actually is going to answer this, but one of you have a go. CMP 376. What is it?
I'm going to start on that one because the questions get harder. Catherine and Kyle can answer the really hard ones. It's essentially the application of milestones into transmission offers. So for a long time, transmission offers haven't really had milestones in them at all. They've sort of had guideline programs and such like, but they've not had milestones that can be applied to them in order to sort of help terminate the offers like there have been at distribution. So this is the introduction of milestones into transmission offers.
And it has been a long time coming. So I think most of our listeners have probably heard the word CMP 376 over the last year quite a few times as that sort of code mod has gone through the process.
It's definitely been on our grid news and views from time to time saying this is coming, and now it's come.
Yeah, I think that I was always, as a layperson, really confused by the fact that at distribution you had to get letter of authority, so that there were milestones, very clear milestones at distribution, and have been for a very long time, and they were quite hard fought over. And I was aware that there just wasn't that same level of milestoneage at transmission, and it kind of feels maybe quite late. That could have potentially happened a bit earlier.
Well, yeah, there's a bit of history there because the proposal was when we introduced milestones at distribution, say those M1, M2, so when you have to get your land rights, your planning consent, and so on at distribution level, the proposal was to introduce them at transmission as well. So that was it was part of the ENA Open Networks project. The TOs and Grid were involved in that process. But I don't know if you want to speak to that, Pete, about the kind of outcome of that and how it backfired.
Yeah, it did, because I think there was a realisation quite a few years ago now, I'm struggling to remember exactly how many, that there were needed to be milestones in transmission offers to try and line up transmission distribution, because there was lots of talk about, and there always is, about trying to align processes across transmission and distribution, and this was one of them, where distribution schemes had the milestones, transmission schemes didn't. So it was essentially that there was an ENA Open Networks project that went, hey, let's just take all the distribution milestones, extend them a little bit, and then just apply them at transmission, which is sort of what happened. And then
and they consulted quite a lot about it. We came up with concepts of cumulative delay, tolerance periods, which were different for different voltage levels. There was a lot of thought that went into it, but ultimately, when it then came out from the ESO and they tried to put that into people's connections agreements, people might remember getting Appendix Q's. Oh, thank you.
I think it was Q.
I was about to pick a random letter there. So they did try it, and it was strongly contested by transmission customers.
The transmission customers went, this hasn't been through a CUSC modification change process, so it's not sort of legal, and therefore we don't agree with it. Change our offers, please. And so the ESO had no choice but to sort of end up taking it out. So I think it ended up going into offers for a period of about 6 months or something like that.
And they then issued, they wrote to those customers, and actually then they issued a public letter to say, we are, if you've got one, ignore it. It's not binding. We're going to go through a CUSC process.
We've dropped one, and CMP CUSC modification
exact proposal.
Right. Okay. Cool. Good. I should know that, obviously. Sorry, I took us down a rabbit hole. I wasn't meant to. That wasn't a question. Oh, and by the way, I realised that I never actually introduced myself on these, so I probably should at some point. So I'll do it now. I'm Hugh Taylor. I'm CEO at Roadnight Taylor. I'm nominally in charge, and I'm the layperson in the room. So there you go. Should I go back to the questions I'm meant to be asking?
That was one of the questions.
That was one of the questions.
I think it was great. I think it was great. We've jumped in because
I went early,
and I think it's an excellent.
How did we get here?
It's an excellent introduction to the subject.
Good, excellent. So I haven't wasted any time. I might actually ask Kyle this, put him on the spot, and who does it affect?
So it impacts anybody who's effectively in the queue at the moment that has a signed offer, and anybody that's going to be putting a new application in as well. So there was quite a lot of discussion and contention over how it would be applied, whether it would be applied to those, you'd be applied retrospectively to those that were already in contract. And I would say that actually in the last 6 months, there's been a lot of rapid progression. It's taken a long time, as Ruben said, to get to that point. It did feel as if it was a little bit cyclic, with a number of different 12
different variations
on the same
I
theme.
think they're called
Whack'ems. Yeah, exactly. It's a great.
And what does a Whack'em stand for?
It's a work group alternative. I don't even know what the C is, actually.
I thought it was maybe like slang for like a whack-a-mole.
No, it's an acronym. WACM. Yeah, they're alternative work group
formalised
proposals.
options within the CUSC mod proposal.
Right,
We'll get someone. I will have to get someone from from one of the CUSC groups now to tell us what does a Whack'em actually stand for. But they're alternative proposals. So the working group can say, yeah, thanks very much, original proposer. But actually, we think if we tweaked your suggestion in a couple of ways, it's a very democratic process, altering the CUSC.
You then do get really big differences between some of them. Some were really specifically driven by the TOs. You could see they were driven by specific TOs because their aim was to try to remove kind of blockers and barriers in the queue.
Which is a good thing,
Yeah.
right?
But then you also had a number of different kind of customer groups from various different sizes and backgrounds, and they would have quite different views. So they wouldn't necessarily be against the concept, because I think most developers understand that if we're continuing the situation we're in, you're just not going to get to building out proper projects. So there doesn't need to be a process, but at the same time, it's got to be something that's palatable for all. So the original was quite clear, but effectively the variation that's been selected and that Ofgem's agreed to is effectively the original, but also applied to those retrospective customers. So that does mean that anybody with a connection contract will either have milestones applied, or they will have the opportunity to go and put a modification application in over a 6-month period to then make their change. But once the change is made, that's the kind of hand showing, and that will have an impact on what milestones are delivered.
Yeah, and that sounds really, cool that you can apply retrospectively, and I've never imagined that would happen, but I imagine that in order to be able to do that it must be relatively watered down, weaker than it might have been. Is that...
So the transmission milestones which have been applied, which I think this is probably relatively well understood now, but they are not the same milestones that we use at distribution. So it doesn't take your accepted contracted date when you accepted your offer and just say within 6 months you must have submitted your planning permission. It works backwards from your connection date, and that's really important, because if you're a nuclear power station, you might apply to National Grid and say, I would like to connect in 15 years' time, please, because it's going to take me that long to find a site, do my compulsory purchase of the land and things like that. You've got mammoth timeframes for everything. So if someone comes back and says, here's your offer, but by the way, you've got to have planning permission within 2 years, it's ludicrous. So so instead they work backwards from connection dates, which is and that was something which was kind of fleshed out with the transmission industry, but that does mean, Hugh, it's not a kind of I wouldn't necessarily say it's watered down, but it's a more pragmatic view to approach those really large connections. What it does mean is when you're applying it to the queue, the existing queue, it's not going to have an immediate impact. So if you look at the queue we currently have today, I ran some numbers because I thought you were going to ask this question, so the majority of the queue, over 75% of the queue, will have no milestones that apply for at least a year. So nearly everyone has got about a year to go away and, sort out things like, their actual land agreements, and going into planning, which are going to be the first sort of 2 milestones that they hit. Half the queue don't have any milestones until 2026 and beyond. So that's, sort of 3 years. So we're not going to see kind of an immediate thinning out of the queue as a result of applying these milestones.
And I have heard from at least one developer who's gone, this hasn't been sort of harsh enough. And this was coming from a developer to going, that they'd have really liked to have seen like a land rights milestone apply from the date of acceptance and work, forwards a couple of years, because that really puts the pressure on the more speculative applications that might be in the pipeline. I'm hearing some developers saying it should have been gone further and have been a bit harsher, which is interesting.
Yeah, I guess the pipeline we currently have, the problem is this sort of like 480 gigawatts or so we've got in the queue. There is a huge amount of onshore battery storage, which is relatively, rapid to kind of go through that development process. But you've still got people in the queue who would struggle to go through that process. You've still got to come up with something which is fair and works for, an offshore wind farm, that theoretical kind of new nuclear plant. You can't, and I think the problem we have is that historically, if you asked for a connection date 15 years ahead, you got a connection date 15 years ahead. If you asked for a connection date in 5 years' time, you normally got one in 5 years' time. If we were to sort of rewind to the world of sort of 2016, 2017, 2018, now we've got projects that could move fast, but have been given late connection dates in the 2030s. And now, with these key milestones, there is no impetus for those projects to move fast, because actually, if their connection dates after 2032, they won't have any milestones until, about sort of 20% of this queue have no milestones until after 2030. So for them, they might as well just sort of sit on their hands, and this alone isn't going to be enough to weed those speculative projects out of the queue.
But those that do have only a year to get their first milestones in place, which is land rights.
Yeah, land rights and then planning submission.
And then there's 3 years. If you're sitting on a project and it looks like that might actually be a struggle, but might there be an argument for having another tech amnesty now that this is in place, and it might potentially be more effective?
So Kyle mentioned that everyone's being given an option of so we're about to put milestones retrospectively into everyone's offers. If you're not going to be able to meet your milestones, you're being given this one-off option to ModApp. So rather than a tech amnesty, what you're being given the option of is to push your connection date back. Pete and I were talking about this because there's a bit of a risk here, or quite a significant risk, that people might be saying, I've got a 2029 date. Actually, that means I need to be in a position to be in planning within 2 years. I'm not going to meet that. I might therefore need to ModApp. And the risk is that you ModApp and your connection date might go from 2029 to 2036, 2038. It could be huge.
And you're still carrying that risk. But it would have the impact of getting other people forward in the queue, because you'd be swapping places, right?
It's a difficult one. I'm not sure it necessarily quite works like that.
You'd be giving so you're not swapping places, to be clear, because that there is a very different proposal that actually the ESO have come up with as part of their final recommendations on connections reform. I think we're going to cover that in news and views maybe, but there is a proposal for maybe doing some kind of place swapping, so not a tech amnesty, but a queue position swap option where you'd kind of take someone else's connection date and take their higher liabilities, their higher risky milestone profiles and swap. But that's not, that is still just an idea on the table. The proposal with milestones is basically to incentivize people to get more realistic connection dates into their offers, and to be able to give Engesso the teeth to be able to just terminate contracts where you miss that milestone. So there's a really clear, they don't want to give people a tech amnesty in some ways, because a tech amnesty gives you the option for giving up your tech for free. This is going to be a penalty. This is going to be, if you miss your milestone, we will terminate your connection agreement and you will have to pay us your cancellation charges. So these projects, there is a significant negative impact, and there's a lot of stick here and not a lot of carrot, if you miss a milestone.
But I'd also say that the tech amnesty process, I've heard other people saying, why can't we have a regular tech amnesty process? But basically, a regular tech amnesty process just means you're completely changing the way cancellation liabilities are applied, because you'd have to screw up another CMP 192 around how liabilities are applied, which might actually be a sensible thing, because it probably doesn't work very well at the moment.
Yeah,
but that's a different.
That's another podcast. But yeah, there needs to be tech amnesties. They remove that stick bit. They don't punish people for having stayed in the queue, and then they give them this kind of free option to get out. Whereas the idea of kind of user commitment and transmission cancellation charges are that there's a penalty for if you stay in the queue and your project's not actually going anywhere. If it's a zombie project in inverted commas, or I think we probably need to give Regen a credit for sleeper projects as a good term. Projects which are they're not necessarily entirely fictional. They're just not moving forwards. They're staying in that grid queue right at the back.
I like that, sleeper. I must say the zombie project thing, that's never really worked for me. But so should we take a break? I hope you're really enjoying this episode so far and are gaining a lot of very useful insight. If you're a new listener, I hope that you'll feel like you might come back. If so, make sure you hit the follow button and feel free to sign up to our newsletter, The Connectologist, at roadnighttaylor.co.uk, so you don't miss out on any of the podcast webinars, case studies, thought pieces and explainers. Great, welcome back. Right, what are the penalties? So, if I miss my land rights milestone in a year's time, and what's that going to mean to me?
Yeah, so for the first 3 milestones, which interestingly are numbered slightly the wrong way around. So the land milestone is actually milestone number 3.
Okay.
But
it comes first.
Yes.
Because we're working backwards from...
No.
Oh,
They just put it in the list in a funny order.
Yeah, M3 comes first, then M1 and then M2.
It's just because they try to align it as closely as possible with the distribution milestones. So although, as Catherine's rightly said, they're quite different in reality in terms of the dates that sit behind them, the actual names are the same. So for example, milestone 4 doesn't actually apply to transmission assets either. So it's only 1, 2, 3 are the first initial set of milestones that you could be more concerned about, and then it's 5 onwards. But 4 doesn't apply to transmission assets, and 3 comes before 1.
Oh God!
A little bit of a complicated.
I think the Roadnight Taylor, just looking at Hugh's face, I think our strong recommendation: don't ignore the milestone numbers.
Ignore the numbers.
Okay, cool.
Just call them land rights, planning submission, planning consent. Everyone knows what that means.
So I miss land rights, which is the one I'm most worried about because it happens in a year's time, let's say.
So at this moment in time, based on the rules that we applied, termination of the contract. So the first 3, so therefore your land rights, your submission of your planning, and your gaining the planning consent, all 3 of those could lead to automatic termination if you weren't to meet those milestone dates. There is a little bit of kind of wiggle room because there is, you've got your date and then you've got the date and the time between that date and any termination offer being processed.
I think it's 60 days.
It's 60 days, yeah. So there is a 60-day.
And you can appeal with a list of there are a specified list. I think there's only 5 exemptions,
yes.
But they are really quite specific. So it's like a force majeure or something like that. It'd be as if you're going to your insurance company and having to.
I think if any developers are used to distribution milestones being applied.
Or not.
Or not apply. I think this is the point. That
this is very
distribution milestones have always been a little bit sort of down to the discretion of the planners or the managers in the connections teams or whatever. And there's often been a dialogue, a conversation. Well, we're going to submit planning soon. Honest. And then 6 months later,
and the planner's
we're
gone,
going to submit planning soon.
At least you replied to my email. I've got 2 customers who didn't. So
it's been pretty sort of casual the way milestones are applied at distribution, but I don't think that that's going to be the case with the way ESO applies the milestones.
So that, yes, those first three, automatic termination of your construction agreement. So it's just worth perhaps making that differentiation that you contract with the ESO, you have a connection agreement, your BCA, and a construction agreement. The construction agreement is basically effectively saying, we're going to build this in this year, we're going to give you this bay of this substation, and this is how much tech you're going to have, and so on. So it's basically kind of cancelling we're going to build stuff and then cancelling down your tech. You could actually then you could sort of stay in contract and kind of go back in again. But as you say, we would have had this penalty in terms of having to pay cancellation charges.
Okay, so that's the cancel. So if my contract is cancelled, I've missed my opportunity. I've got all of those sunk costs in terms of that development risk capital. So what about those cancellation charges? How does that work?
So they are applied in full, and this is quite punchy, right? Because you might sort of say, well, if these projects kind of haven't gone anywhere, then maybe the TO hasn't spent much. So securities and liabilities, which we've probably got some explainers and webinars on our podcast, we can put some links in the chat. But effectively, depending on where you are on that sort of securities and liabilities profile, you will have either be securing, so you'll be paying a cash security or giving a letter of credit. You'll either be securing all of your liability or a proportion of your liability. So, and that changes at a point called trigger date, so about 4 years before your connection. If you're more than 4 years before your connection and your offer gets cancelled down, National Grid will just say, thank you very much, we're going to bank that money that you gave us as cash security. That's your penalty. Goodbye, we've terminated your contract. If you are less than 4 years to connection, then actually it's worse than that. They will say, because you'll only have been securing a proportion of your total liability, they will say, thanks very much for all the cash we've got in the bank. We're going to take that. And now we're going to invoice you for the remaining, and it'll either be another 58%, because you'll have been securing 42%, so they'll invoice you for the remainder. Or if you were quite close and you actually got consent and you terminated a project late in the day, you would only have been securing 10%. So they will come back and invoice you for 90% of that. That's the point at which, there is historic precedent of, the generating asset or whatever essentially folding, because they paid the £2 million and someone comes back and says, yeah, great, now we need the other 18 million, and they go, actually, we haven't got £18 million worth of cash. We're now a bankrupt asset. Yeah. Wow. So there are serious penalties once cancellation charges are applied in full.
Wow. I think for a lot of developers, they see the initial impact of losing the right to the construction element and therefore their ability to actually connect. But it's that secondary impact that's then probably going to be the more critical one.
So, developers are really going to go and need to look at their cancellation profile because, it does change over time and it generally ramps up the closer you get towards connecting. So it's trying to work out, what does that profile look like? And every scheme's different, isn't it? So some schemes, the cancellation charges for the scheme are not.
Well, sometimes it's zero. You might be sitting on schemes where you have no liability for several years.
For some of them, they're tens and tens and tens, or if not hundreds of millions.
Yeah.
Even if they've started small. So there's lots of schemes where developers have accepted the offers because initial securities and cancellation liabilities are zero or next to zero, but they very quickly ramp up.
And so now, for those offers, those developers need to go back and look at their profile, so their S-curve, which National Grid will have issued, which gives them this idea of profile of risk. And they basically need the key things that they need to look at when their milestones are going to hit, whether or not they think they can meet them, and if they were to not meet a milestone, what would be the cancellation charge at that date? So I would be going through my S-curve with a highlighter to highlight what my liabilities would be at those milestone dates, and I suspect that will make people understand the risk of, can they stick with their existing connection agreement, or do they need to mod up because it's just too risky? If I've got a planning date that I think there's a 50% chance of me missing, and I've got £5 million of liability by that point, I'd be mod apping.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask Catherine and Kyle perhaps a point of detail. If you mod app before the trigger date, that pushes the trigger date back, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. This is a point from and the trigger date being to do with your securities and liabilities, your cancellation charges, not to do with milestones. Yes, if you mod app after your trigger date, that does not change. You can never untrigger once you've triggered a project.
Importantly, it's not that you've submitted the mod app; you must have accepted the modified offer before the trigger date.
So that's a point of detail, but I think that's really important because if if you've gone over that trigger date, it's a bit of a point of no return to then being able to go back to sort of different levels of securities and cancellation charges.
And I mean, we say this a lot, but it is important to stress that this kind of initial period where National Grid is saying, and to be really clear, it is 6 months for everyone who's getting
from the 27th of November.
From the 27th of November, thank you, Pete. So the clock is ticking to get mod apps in if you want to move your milestones. After that period of time, after that 6 month period of time, with the best will in the world, something can have changed in your project and you can think, gosh, we're radically not going to meet these dates anymore. I want to mod app, and that will have no impact on your milestones.
So you can still mod app.
You can still mod app.
You can still move out your connection date.
But you're still at risk of termination if you don't get that planning or if you don't get... So that's why these have to be robust dates that you can meet. You'd want there to be a little bit of slack in that programme.
And how do you calculate? Because you said you need to work out when your milestones actually apply, when they hit. How do you go about that, Kyle?
So it does vary depending on exactly when your connection date is, so how far away you are from that particular date. And then effectively, I think there is an ESO calculator.
There is a calculator. Yeah. It's a bit broken actually, but it's.
Can we link to that?
Yeah, let's link to that.
Okay, we'll link to that in the whatever the description.
But you just literally work back from your connection date. So
and just whilst we're talking about the milestone calculator, what other resources? Because the ESO have got, you said, workshops and guides.
Yes.
So what other resources can we point
That's really important actually. So the ESO are doing as much as possible to make this clearer for people. They're hosting a whole load of webinars. So there are a couple that have already happened. You can watch those on the ESO's website. There's one that's happening next week. There is one in January as well. So I think that's the last one.
Okay, we'll get the date and we'll put that in the description
exactly.
as well.
So there's a lot of kind of as I say, there's some guidance that the ESO have put out. We can link to that. And ultimately, because these are fairly generic questions, your customer account manager will know the answer to when your milestones are. That's an easy question you can ask them. So if all of those resources fail, then email your CAM.
Cool. I have done so badly in terms of sort of jumping around and not actually answering the questions on here. So you can just tell me if we've already covered these. We've got what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of CMP 376?
Well, I think the strength is this automatic termination, no faffing, none of this kind of deliberation on those first 3 milestones.
I think we picked up on one of the weaknesses, that maybe it doesn't give enough impetus for some projects to be picking up on milestones sort of early on. If you don't have milestones kicking in for 4 or 5 years from now, then it still is not going to clear out the queue. So I think that was the point Catherine was making earlier, that one of the weaknesses, it still doesn't quite have the teeth to clear out the queue in the way that
in a timely manner. I mean, I think this could help clear the queue, but it'll take 4 years to do it.
Because if you're already contracted, you take your construction agreement now and look at the appendices and your user requirements. If you did a comparison between your user requirements and what you're going to get in terms of milestones, and okay, the terminology is slightly different, but generally there's a lot of alignment there. They're going to be quite different. Your user requirements are generally, I've looked at maybe about 10 applications that are kind of similar to this, where the user requirements would be much earlier. Now, okay, they're not contractually bound, but from a contract manager perspective, within a developer, you could easily go, well, hold on, actually, this is better. These milestones are actually better dates than my user requirements. But the danger is then that if you leave it like that and then don't focus on how you're going to get to those milestones in the future, then that's where time quite quickly runs out, because as we know, for a lot of these big projects, it can take a long time to get through planning. As Catherine said, there are some exceptions. So if, for example, planning is delayed and it's out with your control, then there's a potential ability there to kind of make that case. But they are quite specific.
They are quite specific.
Yeah.
So I think the example would be sort of if your planning result was called in for like a judicial review or something, that would be outside your control. It would be from a planning perspective, it would be a legal question about whether the right process had been followed. If your planning was, if your decision was delayed because you hadn't done the right bird surveys, that's just your fault. You messed up, and there's not going to be any leeway for that. So actually credibly meeting those dates and doing your best efforts, I agree, is really quite key from a developer perspective.
And one question I've had on quite a few occasions is, well, what if it's kind of under this kind of force majeure sort of concept? What if you're contractor was delayed due to, therefore they're the unforeseen event. So you're all ready to go as a developer, but your contractor is delayed because of resource or whatever it happens to be. But that would not be seen as force majeure.
I was going to say,
No,
legally
that
speaking, that's
would
not.
that would be a get out of
Absolutely,
jail
because
free
Yeah,
card. That
because it's
everyone could play.
it's you've contracted with that particular party, and that particular party is not actually contracted to the ESO or the TOs. So in that particular case, as you said, it would effectively open up the doors. So it's going to be really quite specific, and therefore genuinely circumstances that are out with your control.
There is an exception which is probably going to become relevant as we get to later milestones, which is that if the delay is caused by the TO or the ESO, you are exempt. So that is probably something we are going to see needing to be discussed once we get into kind of construction of some of these assets, because or even consenting the TO substations. There are definitely some delay risks.
I don't think the ESO pays a cancellation charge to themselves.
No, they don't. No, so I don't think they don't have to worry about it.
To the developer.
Quite correct. Yeah.
Actually, it's a good point. It's one thing we've not really covered, because we focus really on the first 3 milestones, but actually on those later milestones, it's not the exact same situation. It's not automatic kind of termination with a few exceptions. There is more of a bilateral conversation at that particular point in time. So it would still be expected you have to bring a lot of evidence on why certain things have not happened on time, but it does open itself up to a bit more bilateral conversation.
more like at distribution.
Yeah, so the wording is that the ESO would have if you miss a milestone, the later 3 milestones, if you miss, the ESO would have the right to terminate, whereas the ESO effectively has an obligation to terminate in the event of missing the first 3 milestones.
Oh, right, okay.
So it is written
yeah.
that the ESO will automatically terminate unless one of these exemption criteria is met. So that is really quite different, isn't it?
You're going to have this wave of modification applications on the transmission side for various different reasons, whether it's queue management or a number of the other changes that are kind of following through as well. So, it's going to be quite a busy period.
The ESO are going to have a wave of variation agreements to issue in Q1 next year. An absolute tsunami, because they're going to have to vary everyone's agreements to put milestones in.
And that's whilst they're doing everything that they are with these 2-stage offers. I
Exactly.
mean, they're busy people, right?
Yes, they are very busy people.
Do we feel for them?
We definitely feel for them. And I think it's probably worth putting a plug out for the fact that, so Pete mentioned that this came in on the 27th of November. So if you are applying to the ESO now, if anyone's still actually submitting transmission applications, not sure that we advise that, but if they are, then you actually have a customer choice. If you're applying now, you will get a single, even if you're in England and Wales, you'll get a normal offer. So you won't go through the 2-step process anymore. You'll get a full offer. You have a choice. You can either ask for that full offer to come out with the milestones already in it, or just to make things fair, because there are customers at the moment who will have offers that don't have those milestones in, and they've got up to 6 months from the 27th of November to mod app those. You are allowed to not have your initial offer have the milestones in, but you would have to get an agreement to vary within the following 3 months. So the ESO kind of put out, it's a common sense request really, get the milestones in your original offer. It just saves you having to have a variation agreement, saves them some extra paperwork. You're not going to gain anything. They're still going to be the same milestones. So I think that's just worth bearing in mind. If you're applying now, have that conversation up front and just say, happy for the milestones to go in originally.
Cool. Great. Thank you, all of you. How do we think Kyle performed?
I think we'll let him come again.
Well, in fact, you're recording a Grid News and Views this afternoon, so I'm looking forward to listening to that, because I shan't be on, obviously. Thank you, all 3 of you. That was great. Hopefully, it's been good for people out there. Thank you, people out there, for taking the time to listen. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for taking your precious time to listen to this episode. Now, not everyone is ready to have a connectologist in their life. For others, it's just too expensive. And as our team is so small, we do have to be very selective in what work we take on. And that's why we put so much effort into these shows. We want our society to have the equitable energy system it needs in order to decarbonise and to thrive. So we want to help to topple as many connections barriers as we possibly can, in spite of our size. So please do feel free to ping a link to this episode to anyone you know who might be interested, because it would mean so much to everyone here.